So I am the community to community program manager at After the Fire. And what we do every month is we gather here online to talk about relevant topics to communities that are have experienced a wildfire in their area and are in that process of recovery. And we share this knowledge from areas that have been through this process before, and then pay it forward to other areas that are just entering that space. So we knew that the seasons were changing. We thought, oh, we better get ready for rain. And this is the theme we came up with for this month. We just listen and hear what people are concerned about. And this was one topic, and who knew? Certainly I did not predict that when we scheduled this session that we would have already experienced record-breaking rains. I mean, really, it's been crazy. And in fact, maybe you know, or maybe you don't know that as part of my job, I compile a news digest every week on what's going on with wildfire, what's going on with resiliency efforts, what's going on with communities that are rebuilding after the fire. And this week's issue certainly had a lot about rain. So I feel like our topic is trending. Always good, I suppose. It's urgent and it's important. And I think it's not just only relevant to those people who are simply recovering from fire, but it's really relevant to all of us right now as we hear of landslides, taking out infrastructure, homes that have been damaged. We're wondering about the quality of our water. We're in drought, and yet we have so much water all at once. So these topics are top of mind for all of us. And I'm really grateful to have four very impressive, wonderful speakers on our call today who can speak to different aspects of this topic and help us understand, as those leading recoveries or experiencing recovery, what we should be doing, but also even us who maybe weren't personally impacted, what we can be doing on our land to keep our land, water, and other resources in good shape. So we're going to start off. I'm just going to introduce our folks one at a time and give them a chance to speak for about 10 minutes. And then, so with our four speakers, we'll do that, and then we'll go ahead and have time for questions after they share their information. And I hope that sounds good to you. We have folks from both California and Oregon on the line, and I'm so excited to hear from them myself. I'm ready to learn. I hope you're ready to learn as well. This session is recorded, and we go ahead and share this we hope for years to come as a resource for folks who might want to learn about this topic. So let's start out with Caitlin Cornwall. Caitlin is the Senior Program Manager at the Sonoma Ecology Center here in Sonoma County. We have been through several fires year after year, and she's had experience in taking care of land and protecting natural resources through her work there, and has learned lessons along the way. And I've asked her to share about her experience, what she's done, what she's learned, maybe some different practices that are practical and approaches that are informed by science. Caitlin, I'd like to offer you the mic to speak now.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. So I am reporting to you from Sonoma Ecology Center, which is a place-based nonprofit. We have a home base in the Sonoma Valley, although we do work more broadly than that. The fires that we've been responding to started in 2017 and then again in 2018 and 2020. And the experiences that I'm telling you about, we felt like we learned from scratch without any preparation, because there had not been a fire in our area for 50 years. And now, now there's more experience for us all to learn from. So on the downside, we didn't know what we were doing. And it was really a couple of weeks after the fire. Our fire was in early October. It was a couple of weeks after the fire when we realized that our area was not going to get cleanup for quite a long time, because we were in a more rural part of the county. And we realized that there were these piles of ash and debris sitting around from burnt houses and burnt vehicles that in some cases were sitting very close to streams or on steep slopes. And that was when we started worrying about toxicity from ash and debris getting into our streams. And particularly, we have a lot of streams that host steelhead and beaver and a lot of wildlife that we did not want poisoned. So I think the most relevant experience that we had was mobilizing from scratch a volunteer heavy effort to place wattles, mostly some sandbags, around the ash and metal and debris from burnt houses and vehicles. We knew we couldn't do it all, do all of them. So we used GIS to create a map of priorities. We prioritized structures that had burned and structures that were on slopes and structures that were within 100 feet or 200 feet of streams that we knew had steelhead. And this really helped guide our work and prioritize. And that mapping effort ended up being shared with the agencies like the Army Corps and their contractors. So that ended up being a good science-driven, sensible approach that we were able to contribute to the larger agency effort. So I think that's a good thing to do, prioritize, can't do it all. Also, we already had relationships with county government, and we were able to get from them confidential information about burned landowner contact info, as long as we swore up and down that we wouldn't use it for anything else. And so that helped us gigantically in reaching people. That's the very hardest thing, as you all know. When people have burned their house down and they have left, it's very hard to reach them.
Who did you ask to get that information?
We went through the incident command structure, but the information ultimately came from the county's own GIS staff. And we have GIS staff on our staff, so they already knew each other. We had worked with them before. That helped. So all the pre-existing relationships that we had with different levels of agencies was massively helpful. We were sort of a known entity. So we were lucky enough to have a kind of general among our volunteers who spent hundreds of hours with Google spreadsheets, and other volunteers walking burn neighborhoods and getting permissions from landowners to do the wattling. That was just a huge effort. We did a lot of PR around that. We got people who were in touch with their burnt neighbors, even though they were all spread across a wide area, having evacuated. And that went on for months. It was really a long process. And we had to create checklists and workflows so that we could track where different parcels were in the process. Then there was a whole other effort about getting supplies. I think the supplies thing, like wattles and stakes and stuff, I think that's easier now. We, at that time, were able to switch one of our water quality grants that we had from the state to work on this so that our staff could have their time covered. I think that is a bit harder now. Well, I don't know. Sometimes it's harder because there are so many fires going on all the time. It's not like a novel request anymore. But on the other hand, I think government funders are more understanding now and more experienced with crises. So that helped to be able to pay our staff to work on this stuff.
Was that mostly public funded then when you did those efforts, or did you have to use some of your own?
It was mostly public funded. However, I will say one of the long-term ramifications of that effort was developing great relationships with a lot of landowners who now, some of them are paying out of their own pocket for us and other contractors and nonprofits to do ongoing recovery work on their land. So for anyone working in a neighborhood context or in a nonprofit context, I mean, all these contacts that you make after a crisis are just so precious because people's minds are really opened by a crisis like this, and they may be seeing their land in new ways, and that may make good projects possible that weren't before. I want to also mention something quite important that it isn't about recovering from the last fire, but it's about getting ready for the next one, which is that I think it's important to push to make pre-crisis agreements between agencies and local governments and community-based organizations, pre-inked agreements, so that when the next fire comes or when the next flood comes, everyone knows that these community-based organizations can step in and that they have skills and that they, yes, they get supplies, yes, they get the data. There isn't, well, it's a distraction to have to work that stuff out in the heat of the moment. So if community-based organizations can become part of the incident command information system, then action can happen a lot faster.
And would that be at the county level then to try to organize that? Is that with public-private partnerships, or is that completely like community organizations already working together, do you think?
I would say the first two. So working first through the county's incident command structure, and from there, from that incident command hub, they can reach to other agencies that get pulled in an emergency. And then also you mentioned public-private. I think that's also a place that could be helpful. We haven't done this. I think it would be a good idea actually is to sort of pre-place orders for things like wattles, and just be on the list so that they come to you, and that there isn't a shortage. Another really important thing is that if volunteers are going to be placing wattles, they must be trained. It's very easy. It seems like the easiest thing in the universe to place a circle of wattles around a burn house, but it's actually not. If you don't install them correctly, and on contrary, you are wasting your time and you could make the problem worse. So it's really important that either skilled staff or well-trained volunteers are leading and are present at every installation. The last thing that we want to do is actually concentrate the runoff of toxics. And so everything I've been talking about is about toxics. There's a whole other post-fire effort that we did and are still doing, which is repairing erosion that was exacerbated by fire and the first rains after fire. So all of that stuff is really important to stay on. And we have found that foundation and public funders understand that those needs are multi-year. So things like ditches and culverts. And we haven't done a lot of revegetation in burn scars because generally there's been enough natural reveg, and the disturbance to the ground that is caused by tromping around newly burned places isn't worth the payoff. But in the locations that even before the fire tended to concentrate water, those are highly vulnerable after fire and remain so for years. So that's a really important place to focus. And of course, higher in the watershed is more effective than lower in the watershed. I have lost track of my time, Pamela. Can you remind me?
I know we're right about there. We're right about there at 10 minutes. And thank you so much for sharing that bit of information. There's some really good pointers in there. If you, Caitlin, have resources that may be online that you were able to put in the chat or something so that we can take a look at those, I can share them after with the recording. That would be really helpful. And thank you so much. Our second speaker, and if you do have a question for Caitlin, go ahead and put it in the chat and we can get to it a little bit later. I'd like to introduce Lisa McKaylee, who is a scientist, and she's the president and CEO of Pepperwood Preserve. She's also one of the directors on our board, an amazing ecological, brilliant person and I love Pepperwood Preserve. In fact, my daughter did an internship there as a teen. Such a wonderful place. And she's going to speak to us a little bit about what's going on with the ecology, what's the science that we have to be aware of when we're talking about rain in these burn scars. Lisa, thank you so much I know you're a very busy schedule, and I'm glad you're able to be here this morning.
So much for having me, Pamela.
Yeah.
Happy to be here. So yeah, I'm largely an administrator now at Pepperwood, and I help put together sort of research teams around questions. But my original training was in watershed science, hydrology and geomorphology. So this question's of great interest to me personally. And I was asked to sort of talk about like, what's the science behind the fire impacts on the ground? So I'm really glad that Caitlin covered sort of the toxic part of the issue, because I do think that's the very first immediate thing to think about. And I was actually surprised that our local water quality control board didn't have an emergency sampling plan really in place for looking at the impacts of those toxins. And it makes me think that probably a lot of communities don't necessarily have that in place. So that's also maybe just something to think about is, are there key places where if there's a lot of burned homes contributing those toxins, do you want to be sampling impacts on water quality? But I want to talk a little bit more about the impacts of the burn on the sort of watershed response of the landscape. And basically there is this very common theory that the fire basically creates a hydrophobicity, and that word means that it will actually be water repellent potentially. Part of that comes from the chemistry of sort of chaparral type habitats that have oils in their leaves, and they leave this residue that can contribute to hydrophobicity. And the other component of that is the idea that very fine ash can block soil pores and make it again sort of water repellent. In a traditional setting where you see this play out, it actually can take a couple rainfalls to create that water barrier layer, because the ash that's on the surface sort of gets pushed down deeper into the layers. So your hydrophobicity effect can actually increase at the beginning of your fire season. It might not be, you might not have the worst flash flood type considerations just after the fire, so it can get worse. We're part of a large collaboration with the U.S. Geological Survey that was initiated after 2017, starting at Pepperwood, and then expanded to the whole 2017 fire zone, and is now, at least in California, following a lot of the big fires. So there could be an opportunity if people want an actual field study of impacts in their area. What they do is go out there and literally put what's called an infiltrometer on the soil, and they measure how fast water can sink into the soil. And that is really the only direct way to get that fire impact measurement. And what we're finding is that these responses are very variable in the coast ranges, where you have very thick soils that can form cracks. You know, what the fire does in terms of cracking the soil and creating these cracks can sort of mitigate some of these hydrophobicity effects. And so I think it's really fair to say that I think the research that's out there, a lot of it came from Southern California, where this can be a very severe effect, and they have severe flash flooding. And I will say in California, when you have a fire, soon after, the California Geologic Survey teams up with other agencies to make you sort of it's sort of a hazard map of where the slopes, and they put them as bright red, where there's the biggest chance of slope failures happening, all different kinds of slope failures. We found those somewhat over predictive for our area. But also we didn't have any big rains since our fires. And really the storm we just had is the big first test of what's gonna happen out there. But I think just getting the word out to people, understanding, you know, I think that the agencies are pretty good about saying that there's a higher risk of flood risks. We're very lucky to have a Sonoma Water be our local water agency, and they really jumped on the opportunities. So for those of you who do work with water districts, like they were able to get funding for a flash flood warning system, which they'd always wanted, but the fire created this opportunity for them to implement it. And we're hosting some of those rain gauges for the water agency right now. And certainly this whole system went into effect. You know, for this storm that we just had. We also jumped right on getting a fire camera network immediately after the storm, which is not as related to rainfall, but just to say again, sometimes you have this window of opportunity immediately after the fire to get resources to respond to future fires. Mm-hmm. In terms of erosion and runoff, I think, and I know that Maya, I think, is going to talk about this a little bit, but since our entire preserve did burn in 2017, 50% of our 3,200 acres burnt again in 2019, we also were left with sort of what do you do on the ground And we found opportunities with downed trees to orient them on contour. And that was sort of what we did on site. I feel like a lot of folks think that they need to do, I think the wattling and containment of toxic sites is a top priority, but I also saw a lot of landowners being sold other kinds of erosion control services that weren't necessarily appropriate. So I assume Maya will be getting a little bit more into that. But I guess the summary on the science side is there's some good science out there, but making it site specific for your community is important. And I guess the basic rule that we go with in the Bay Area, there is a threshold. It's sort of like you're not really going to necessarily see a lot of things moving until you get about an inch of rain per hour, this sort of 24 millimeters per hour rainfall. That's kind of when you should be prepared to see something happen. So that works for the Bay Area. I have a feeling for folks on the call, it may be pretty applicable. So that's when, when you see the rainfall hitting that kind of intensity, an inch per hour, that's when things might start moving, and up to that threshold seems like not so much. But again, these are all hypotheses that need to be tested for your specific landscape. And certainly it's always better to be safe than sorry in this realm. But the kinds of mud flows and debris flows that Southern California has, not necessarily the kind of mechanism that happens in Northern California. We have more shallow landslides and along creeks, and then we have very deep earth flows that kind of can get mobilized by this. And that's what we're seeing after this storm at Pepperwood. We have a very big, slow moving landslide where the toe is moving some more. So it's certainly, in terms of the road, I think the road teams get hit the hardest on this in terms of responding. I know we had boulders in the road on the way up to work today. So I haven't been involved as much in those debris cleanups, but that's kind of what comes to mind.
Yeah, and I would say there's certainly an argument for jumping on these recommendations that we've heard both from Caitlin and Lisa, and preventative work that you can do, because there's a big cost to a community and to public works to have to clean up these landslides. What did we hear? There were so many up in Northern California just after this last rain. Highway 70 leading up in Plumas County. That's going to take a while. Down on Highway 1, we're seeing these landslides, and that's really, it's not just, my hillside is slipping, but actually we can't get around. It costs time. It's really interfering with the way our communities are functioning in a very practical sense. And certainly our water. And Lisa, I'm curious about how that funding for the infiltrometers and that kind of work. You said Sonoma Water jumped on it. They applied for funding for that. Was that some federal grant, or what was that?
The actual infiltration study was combined funded by Sonoma Water in kind from U.S. Geological Survey, the National Innovation Center, and then PG&E, I believe, kicked in.
Okay, all right, thank you. For those who are, I see that we have some public officials, both from Oregon and California on this call, and I'm sure if they don't already have some of those systems in place, it would be interesting and helpful for them to be able to look into that. And I think there's Caitlin put some resources in the chat, and I welcome any of our speakers to add additional resources. So thank you, Lisa, for sharing. I would like to jump over to Maya Elson. Maya, I heard so much about your work in Santa Cruz County following the CZU lightning complex fires there. Certainly the topography of Santa Cruz County is challenging. This coastal mountainous region, oh my goodness, beautiful, beautiful land, but challenging for being able to care for that land after the devastating fires of last year. You're the executive director of Co-Renewal. This organization, I'll let you explain what your organization does. It's science, it's practical work out in the boots on the ground, and you really mobilize so many efforts to help protect the waterways with innovative way and doing research at the same time. So Maya, welcome to the call, and I'd love to hear more about your work.
Awesome. It's so great to be here with you all. And Caitlin and Lisa, I really enjoyed hearing from you both. And I'm like, oh, I wish I talked to you before the CZU had happened. I'm so glad that this networking is happening now, though. And yeah, I can share, Co-Renewal is a nonprofit organization that's focused on environmental justice, sustainability, and bioremediation research. And I'm actually only, I'm going to be transitioning out of my director role really soon. But I am the manager of our Postfire biofiltration initiative, which was an effort that came after the fires of last year to prevent toxins from entering waterways with fungi, and to research this method and make it, our hope is to come up with methodologies that can be applied in all over the world, but would need to be specified for each ecosystem. So and in addition to working with toxin mitigation with fungi, we're also interested in post-fire ecological regeneration with a whole microbial community approach. So the fungi are obviously a really important part of microbial communities, and they do an incredible job of preventing erosion in a lot of different ways. They create this, our arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which we actually have another research project looking at ways that our arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi can help mitigate heavy metals in agricultural soils. And so we've actually been kind of blending our projects and looking at ways that we can mitigate heavy metals after a fire with the decomposer fungi. And what our study looked at was working with oyster mushrooms, but also how some of these mycorrhizal communities, so these are the symbionts that have a relationship with plants. They have a symbiotic relationship with plants, and they do a lot to really stabilize the soil as well as to deal with heavy metals. So they create this substance called glomalin, which is where 1/3 of the Earth's soil carbon is stored. So it's incredibly important as an aggregate of helping soil hold on to itself. And it's also important in terms of sequestering carbon. And what we're really interested in looking at next, and where a lot of our research is moving, and we also, I should mention, we have had a separate study called Fire in Ecosystem Function that looks at ways that microbial community inoculation post-fire can support ecological regeneration. And that was done in prescribed burns, but not in wildfires. So our more recent study, the Postfire Biofiltration Initiative, has been looking at more of the toxins in mega fires. Yeah, I'm very interested in what these mycorrhizal fungi have to offer the situation. Long story short, I think our decomposers like the oyster have a lot of potential, but I really think that it takes a village to restore an ecosystem, right? An ecosystem is like a village. You need everybody playing their part. And if we want our soil to recover, we need to bring together all the different players. And one way that we've been looking at that is by collecting soil from unburnt reference ecosystems. So if there's an area near where the fire was that didn't burn, that has its microbial community intact, what can we do to create, amplify those microbes and then be able to introduce them to the burnt ecosystem? So that's something that we're looking at. And we're seeking funding for a project that would do that right now. Mm-hmm. And I guess I just wanted to, what feels important to share is I could just share a little bit of our experimental design and some of the themes and some of the things that if people are interested in doing this research, where I would love to see the research move. I can do like a quick share. Can I share my screen here?
I think you can. I think you can. Yeah, there you go.
You guys seeing it? Okay. Yeah. Great. So you guys know after a fire, these are things that we're all familiar with. I don't think I need to share this. And the fungi are playing a very important role in fire ecology. And I think it's important to mention here too, you know, the reason these fires, I think most people are probably familiar with basic fire ecology, whereas, you know, if you don't have a fire for a long time, your fires get bigger and more intense. And we've had, you know, with fire suppression, we've had a dramatic increase in the number of decomposer fungi and the saprophytic or saprotrophic fungi. And we've had a big decrease in our number of mycorrhizal fungi, so the ones that have this symbiotic relationship. And the drought has exacerbated this quite dramatically. It is also worth mentioning here that these fungi are already playing a natural role within these ecosystems of supporting recovery. You know, with this little rain that we've got right now, you know, you get little mushrooms that come up, bugs eat those mushrooms, birds eat those bugs, they poop out seeds, you know, a coyote comes and eats that bird. They're great at kind of kickstarting the regeneration process, as well as preparing the soil for new plants to grow. So our study, the Postfire Biofiltration Initiative, what we did essentially is we inoculated wattles. So we got the mycelium of the oyster mushroom. And the reason we chose the oyster mushroom, I honestly, like, I had a lot of hesitation because it's, people have this idea that like fungi are this silver bullet and they're gonna like fix all the world's problems and we can save the world with fungi. And yes, of course, they have a really important role to play, but they're just one piece of a much larger puzzle, right? And the oyster mushroom is a mushroom that's been studied pretty extensively, more or less. I mean, of course, there's a lot more research that needs to happen, but it has been shown to be able to biodegrade petrochemicals, sequester heavy metals, and is easy to grow and cultivate. So what we did is we set up two different kinds of controls. So we had an area where there was no wattle, and we had a wattle that was not inoculated. And then it didn't rain. And our whole study was really based around having the rain be what waters the mycelium of the fungi and helps it grow. And what we've learned a lot from this experience about inoculation methods. And next time, we're now set up, and if anybody's interested in taking this research further or like doing a you know, expansion of the study or a replicate of the study, I'm like more than happy to support you. We have a lot of ideas and even some materials. We have a wattle machine, and we could inoculate wattles as they're being built. Rather than cutting holes in wattles, which, you know, impacts their structural integrity. So we could inoculate these wattles as they're getting built. And what I'm also really interested in, especially given that we're in this drought, is I have a little list going to remind me of all the things, are buried logs. We found the most mycelial growth in underneath, so not necessarily inoculating the wattle itself unless you have a ton of rain coming, but inoculating underneath, because then it's going to retain moisture a lot better and the mycelium is going to run and be much happier. And then also inoculating logs, like when you have a burnt site, there's a lot of downed wood all over the place. And there's always this part of me that's like, why are we bringing in materials from another place and they're having to get shipped here and we're burning fossil fuels, and there's all of these, you know, secondary impacts of bringing in wattles. And it's worth it if we can protect our steelhead, you know, for sure. But what are some other methods that we can employ, like using materials that are right on the land, using the wood chips, using the logs? We can inoculate logs, but and we can also be preventing erosion if we bury these logs too, and supporting the soil rebuilding at the same time. So we're you know, checking a lot of things on our list of things we want to do to support our land. If we bury these logs, inoculate them, filtering toxins as they're coming through with the mycelium that's present, and we're also creating the conditions for the native microbial communities to return. We haven't yet been able to prove whether or not bringing in, you know, we're using local native species of fungi, but we haven't yet proved that any kind of inoculation actually makes a huge difference. The juries, that was what we're trying to prove last year, and our study didn't work out. So we're not quite sure yet. We still have some analysis going of our samples. We're still working on it. We're hoping to have something useful to say about it soon. But, you know, my intuition here is really that just creating the conditions for the ecosystems to regenerate on their own is gonna, you know, have a really big impact. And help those mycorrhizal fungi, help the soil retain moisture, prevent the debris flow, all of those things. So yeah, I think just messing around and digging holes and laying in logs and inoculating them. And you know, hopefully we can get a little bit more of a scientific methodology for how to do this well. And but I think, you know, if people can just do something simple like that, I think it probably would make a huge difference. And I'd love to hear what kind of results you have as well.
Do you have the capacity to expand your work into some of these new fire areas?
We don't. We've been working on fundraising, and right now we're waiting for it. So we have a couple of outstanding grants, and if we get them, we'd be able to do that.
Okay.
What we can offer right now is if there's people who are excited about this and want to either do a DIY or like a very, you know, scientific, any kind of scale of project with this kind of stuff, we have a lot of information to share and a lot of ideas, and we'd be really happy to support you in that work. Okay. Yeah.
Cool. Can you make sure you put contact information in the chat then if folks want to follow up?
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, totally. How much more time do I have?
Just like another minute, and then we'll hear from Rachel.
Okay. I think I would just also say that, you know, it's been really beautiful to see the way that that people come together to protect their watersheds, and the kind of partnerships that get built, and the way that fire survivors in particular have really shown up for their home place, and developing this deeper sense of belonging in this ecosystem, and a deeper sense of home, and how we can be a part of this ecosystem, and how we can build the right relationship with fire. Has been an incredible journey for a lot of us, and just so grateful to be here with all of you doing this work.
Thank you. Hey, and one question that's related to the content you shared is Rachel's wondering, is it known how deeply I don't know if I know how to
mycorrhizae,
live in the soil,
mycorrhizae,
and how intense of a fire they can recover from on a site?
Yes, so there's a lot of interesting research about this. It's not exactly what you would think. And I should say that a lot of the research on how fire impacts underground microbial communities is done in prescribed burns, because it's really hard getting baseline samples from a mega fire, right? Like, people don't necessarily sample the soil if, you know, they don't know where it's going to burn, which is part of the reason I have this community science dream that I'm working on right now, where we would collect samples from unburnt fire-prone forests and then store them. But that's an aside.
I love citizen science.
So yeah, I think it'd be a really cool way for people to engage with their ecosystems too, and be able to see the before and after. I think we would learn so much. So how deeply mycorrhizae live in the soil? They can live way down. I think, probably 20, 30 feet down, as deep as air can go. They're aerobic organisms, so they need air. So, you know, you think about tree roots, they're as deep as the tree roots or deeper.
I see.
Pretty deep down.
Okay.
And then a lot of them do survive the fire. You know, there is this this idea that, like, these mega fires are sterilizing the soil. And in some cases that is true when you see like that white ash, you know. Lisa could probably speak to this much more than I could, but you know, when you have these areas that burn really, really hot, that generally kills off most of the microbes that are down there. But a lot of these areas, they're still down there. They're just take a while to recover and to come back. I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Thank you
Well,
so much for sharing this work that you're engaged in passionately, and your group down there. And we know that fires are not limited to our area; they are going around the world. So the fact that the scope of your work is international is really inspiring. So
more or less, I
connected.
should say we've got we have study sites in 5 different burn scars. So Sonoma County, Napa County, Mendocino, Butte County, and Santa Cruz County.
Yeah. But
That's
I mean,
where we are.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. And we've got folks from Oregon here. So if you're interested in heading to the next state, you may have an entry point there.
Awesome.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, with the grant that we just applied for, we would have study sites up in Oregon. So
yay.
We might need to talk. Yeah.
Speaking of Oregon, our next speaker is Rachel Whirling, who is on the faculty of the Oregon State University's Forestry and Natural Resources Land Steward program up in Jackson County, Oregon. We know Jackson County experienced the Alameda fire last year, and she works really directly with land care up there. So I've invited Rachel to help us figure out what are the hazards that are present here in our wildlands, whether you've had fire or not, and how we can best keep our land healthy and resilient. So Rachel, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. I will share my screen. I've got a couple of slides just to kind of keep me on track as everyone was sharing. It's very interesting, and Zoom is always funny for conversation, but lots of thoughts, lots of great input. It's amazing to see all the work that everyone's doing. Okay, are you seeing that?
Yeah.
As a slide? Yeah. Okay, so my program is the Land Steward program. It's out of Oregon State University Extension with the Forestry and Natural Resources. And this picture in the background here is of the Alameda fire. So, and we have actually been thinking about fire here a lot, being part of the forestry program. Oregon has lots and lots of forest, and I'll talk about what my program does, but I've been involved, and different people in our departments and stuff have been involved in lots of landowner education about preparing for fires. The Alameda fire really took our community completely by surprise. It went down an urban riparian corridor that was really overgrown with blackberries, and it destroyed half of 2 small towns, and then a number of other outlying places, like 4,000 dwellings were destroyed. 4,000 people lost their homes. Some 2,500 dwellings were destroyed. This is a picture that one of my people in my program took from their house up on the hill of this really directional, very linear fire, not what people have been preparing for. I live in the Ashland watershed, and there's been a ton of money and a ton of preparation to kind of reduce fuels in this forested watershed, and a lot of concern about would Ashland burn, and this was not what anyone was expected. So our post-recovery, fire recovery sounds like it was a little different than you guys, but what was really surprising was how unprepared our supposedly prepared area was for this fire to hit the towns. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what it is that I do. I have this part of all that education stuff. I have something called the Land Steward program, and the heart of it is this training that people take. It's about an 11-week training with a day. We now have it online, but it's comes out of a program that's very field-based. It really appeals to people who live in the rural areas, and because it covers all these different kind of natural resource topics. People go through and they do assessments of their property, and they create a plan. Part of it is forest health, part of it is wildfire preparedness, streams, wildlife habitat, soils, healthy soils, pastures, water systems, rural economics. So people go through this, they really get pretty prepared and pretty connected to their resources in their area as well. We have, from other rural fires that we've had people come back directly and thank us for these programs, saying, we had to evacuate. We were so glad that we'd done this preparation. We had reached out to our fire district, and they said that they would definitely defend our property after the work we'd done. So these kinds of things, like this is kind of like the pre-work that people can do. So kind of getting into that, I wanted to sort of step back, and some of you were sort of mentioning this, But we are all in the West living in this landscape that has been really intensively managed and stewarded by Native people for, millennia, really using fire. And I was trying to find, I have a slide somewhere, but I couldn't locate it, of showing the fire interval, the fire returns. So this is a map, just shows, it's a fun map to play with that looks at kind of traditional Native territories. And I'm doing kind of a sideways land acknowledgement here too, saying I'm on the Dikilma lands. But we have some data, that kind of references that about the fire return interval when you look at old tree stumps and kind of those historic return intervals. And I know that right in our Ashland watershed, our return interval was about every 11 years. And I know some landowners who have had their land for about 20 years and have had 3 fires that have come through their land. So frequency of fire, it's not historically. It was such a part of the ecology, and we really have had a lot of fire suppression. Climate change is throwing that for another complete loop with these really low kind of humidities, and then all this fuel buildup, which we still really have, and which is in terms of the government dealing with this kind of fuel buildup. And this is a forest, a Doug fir, mixed conifer forest from where we are. It's hard to imagine that we're going to be able to handle this in the way that it needs to be handled in our local area. And I think California is actually somewhat ahead of us in Oregon on this. But in our local area, folks are trying to get a prescribed burn association going that will train landowners to be able to really get working on their own land, either kind of collaboratively with other landowners and doing small prescribed burns that will help to, reduce the fuel load, doing thinning and then doing prescribed burns. And what we have been seeing, what we even saw in the Almeda fire along that riparian area, we also have watershed councils that have been doing restorations along that area. This is a picture that I just clipped out of the media recently about the Bootleg fire that was also talking about restorations that were happening around the Sycan Marsh where the Bootleg fire was. And in both of these studies, we've seen, that the fire was less intense in these areas where these invasive, one in the Almeda where the invasive blackberry had been removed and there was native vegetation in there. And in the Bootleg fire, they've been really working on doing thinning and prescribed burns, and the fire was much less intense. Fire is something that's natural to our landscape. I also have a friend who lives in a nearby watershed, off the Applegate River, and one of our recent fires went through there. And she said it was really wonderful from her perspective to see this kind of low fire slowly walking through the forest, kind of regenerating the ecology of the fire. So that's what we're hoping for. That's what we need, what we really have to have. If we don't have that, then we get these mega fires. Climate change makes it hard, of course. So we work with rural landowners a lot with this idea of the defensible space, which is 200 feet. But now the thing that I'm thinking about is, I live in a town in Ashland. My nearest house is 25 feet away. My husband's house burned down in the Almeda fire. His nearest neighbor was 20 feet away. His landscaping in terms of what you can do around the home ignition zone, he had hardly any landscaping. It was his neighbor's house burning down that burned his house. And that's a whole other factor in kind of what our response is. And even the recommendations that are being made for what you should do with your landscaping, how little vegetation you should have or not. In some cases, it's really not going to make a difference if you have 45-mile-an-hour winds and your whole neighborhood is burning down. What you do with your plants and not having any plants, is I think kind of I'm working on getting a nuanced message about that, and I'm also a botanist, and so and know the value of native plants and urban environments also providing habitat. So I'm going to give a talk in a few days about using fire-wise vegetation and also recognizing how plants can actually be an ally in a fire. One of the things is deciduous trees can really be ember screens. And even some of our trees like incense cedar, everything will burn if it's hot enough, but these native trees are also evolved with fire, and they can really catch the embers that cause most of the buildings burning down. Houses burn down. What we've really learned is they burn from the inside out. These little embers, this ember storm, these driven embers get inside the vents and then really burn down from the inside out, unless you have trees that are right up next to your house and are actively on fire. And I don't know if any of you noticed that, like it really struck me when I looked at the pictures of the Paradise Fire, and you see it over and over again, these trees that are burned by the houses, trees that are left. It's not the houses that burn the trees down. And that's one of the things in general, that's one of the things that I hope to nuance. You know, people are just so afraid of fire, and with reason. It's a really terrifying thing, but also recognizing how plants can actually be an ally. That moist deciduous vegetation can actually depress the fire intensity and give your house a kind of a break to not burn. And there are lots of examples of that. Let's see. So kind of just sort of summarizing in our area, what we really need to do is realize that we have to live with fire in some way or another. And what we've been saying in our area for a long time is not if you get a fire, but kind of like when you get a fire. So the big things about that are get educated. And I'm going to follow up with a few links about that we have through OSU. Do what you can do to manage and steward your own landscape, whether you're in a town, learn about the home ignition zone. If you own rural property, connect with resources that can help you get fuels reduction. Definitely pay attention to the defensible space. It can really make a difference. And then the other really big thing is preparing for fire when fire arrives. So going through and learning all those things about your evacuation plan, having redundancies in your important documents if you put things in the cloud, knowing who to turn to locally. And that was one of the things that I was going to say here. Let's see, I think I have a couple of slides. So OSU, our fire program, we actually have a whole program devoted to fire with five full-time professionals around the state. And then lots of our forestry folks really partner with this a lot. But they created a whole series called After the Fire also that you can find if you get into our OSU. I'll put these links in the chat.
Okay.
Kind of our links to all these classes that came afterwards. But this kind of point right here, connect with your local assistance network. And if you think of your extension, wherever you are extension, people are always really connected to the hub of NGOs and agencies that can really help you know what you need to know, whether it's recovery or preparation. Watershed councils are awesome resources. Soil and water conservation districts are really great. NRCS, I was thinking one of the things with us in our local area, our NRCS office, Soil and Water Conservation District, and one of our main watershed councils all share a building. And I think that made them really effective in some of the recovery that was going on as they're right there. They're often thinking about collaborating and working together. And I think that helped that. Let's see, what do I have here for a couple of others? So I'll put these into the chat. So there's the OSU Fire Program, lots of videos of recorded classes of how to recover. In our area, like one of the things people have been concerned about, like, do I replant? Well, our forests have been coming back from fire, for millennia. That's been happening. But there's also a real desire for seedlings, a real need for seedlings in some areas, and we have a real shortage. So there's some information about that.
And we've been hearing, people have been reaching out to our organization about drone reseeding programs. And I've heard some, So tell us what to look out for with those kind of proposals.
I hadn't heard about that. So fire's not my main focus. So I don't hear everything. In fact, I kind of try not to read every single email from that program because it is a whole deluge of emails about fire. So there's a lot out there.
Or if one of the others.
I just really recommend, just like anything, go, whether I'm extension, so I keep saying that, but extension is a great place to start. If you have questions, if you see something that's recommended, or, someplace like the Sonoma Ecology Center, some really trusted resource, the soil and water conservation folks, reach out to them and say, hey, I saw this. Is this a good idea? Like, start there. The people that work in these agencies, and I think everybody almost on this call was a professional. There might've been one person that was a landowner there, but these are the most well-intentioned people. One of the things, we had the Almeida and the Oban Chain fire last fall locally, and the Oban Chain fire was more of a rural fire, and there was a concern reaching out to kind of this rural, more conservative neighborhoods, and like our soil and water conservation folks wanting to speak to people who don't feel really great about the government. We're also part of something called the state of Jefferson around here, which is like not really happy about the government, but these folks are such great folks. That's a great place to start, is with government agencies. So, and I put the Soil and Water Conservation District, they actually have a whole huge page of resources. If we have people from on the call that are from the Almeida fire, they're a great resource.
And we have from up in Santiam Canyon on the call right now too.
Yeah, and I'm not as connected there, but I think that Glenn Ahrens, that slide that I had for that class, I think he's up in that area.
There, okay.
And he's given a lot of these classes. So I really recommend looking into those resources. And I think that is it. So I will stop my share and work on popping
and
resources.
Slater Fire, Karen Chase is helping us remember that there's a Slater Fire as well up in Oregon. So does anyone have any questions for our speaker? We've kind of come to the top of the hour. I wanted to keep this to an hour if possible. I'm just impressed by all the different work, and obviously it takes a ton of collaboration and education to do the right thing, to prepare our land, and to also help mitigate any secondary disasters that may occur from this damage to our land, although acknowledge we need fire. How can we have things set up so that when we have fire, it's not a mega fire, but we can actually regenerate and keep our precious water resources clean. And I love the ideas that Caitlin shared about, and Lisa too, about preemptively setting up agreements, preemptively, or taking this moment now when you can get funding, put in these new resilience efforts. So I am going to share this video. We'll get it up next week on our YouTube, and we will list resources on the description of the video so that if you'd like to share it in your area with folks so they can be more informed, or maybe plug into one of these programs, that information will be available there. And we're on YouTube at After the Fire is the name of our channel. Any last comments? Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. We've had one huge storm. We don't know if we think that up here fire season is done. I know in Southern California, it's not over yet. They haven't had as much rain as us. We don't think the drought is over yet either. Maybe that was a one-shot deal. Maybe we'll get more water. So we'll watch and wait what the weather will bring. Thank you so much. Always looking for new ideas for these meetings that we have once a month as well. If there's a topic you'd like us to delve into and put some expert speakers together, I'm delighted to do that for all of our communities so we can all be more resilient together. And I just want to thank you for being here. Take care, everyone.